Hi, good evening. I'm Joan Salge Blake. I'm a professor at Sargent College in the nutrition program. Go Sargent. But more importantly, I'm a faculty and resident at Claflin down in West Campus. And if you're hungry, you probably never get hungry. But anyway, on Mondays, if you get hungry starting at 3:30, stop by Claflin in the lobby because I have a healthy happy hour and I would love to feed you. So stop by. All right, so with that, I have the fabulous pleasure of introducing Professor Deborah Belle, and she's a professor of psychological and brain sciences at the Boston University College of Liberal Arts. Her research is focused on the impact of poverty and inequality on individual mental health and family functioning, the ways adults and children make sense of poverty, wealth, and economic inequality, and the stresses that arise at the intersection of paid employment and the family life. This evening, Professor Belle speaks to us about some consequences of poverty in our very wealthy nation.
Hello. It is a little hard to see you. Good evening, everyone. On September 1st, 1967, the Reverend Martin Luther King spoke to the annual convention of the American Psychological Association, my discipline. He began by noting what a rich and rewarding experience it was to take a brief break from the day-to-day demands of our struggle for freedom and human dignity and discuss the issues involved in that struggle with concerned friends of goodwill. King pointed out that the field of psychology had given us an important word, the word maladjusted. King saw this as a good word in its implications that, quote, destructive maladjustment should be destroyed, and all must seek the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But on the other hand, King argued, I am sure that we will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. We must never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. King was far ahead of the social science of his time in posing this last problem as one not merely of poverty, but of systemic economic inequality. It's taken the social science community a while, but we have begun to pay attention to economic disparities, to the aggregation of wealth in the hands of the few, as well as to the devastation caused by poverty. We have known for many years that in wealthy nations like ours, there is a striking negative association between poverty and good health. Poor people experience more physical and emotional illness than people who are not impoverished, and poor people die at a younger age than their wealthier peers. This is hardly surprising, given the many risk factors associated with poverty: substandard housing and malnutrition, environmental toxins and pollutants, noise and crowding, violence and the threat of violence, and poor access to health care. But the poverty-illness connection has other sources as well. Human beings respond to threat by mobilizing physiologically. Stress hormones course through our bodies. Our heart rates increase as our bodies prepare for fight or flight. When the threat has passed, these processes reverse, and our bodies return to their previous unstressed calm. However, when threat is chronic, as it often is for poor adults and children, this mobilization process changes. Levels of stress hormones such as cortisol remain chronically elevated, and there is no return to unstressed calm. Over time, these bodily changes inaugurate many disease processes and lead to premature death. These stress and disease processes begin at the earliest moments of life. The greater the number of years a child has spent living in poverty, the more elevated is that child's overnight cortisol level. In utero, the children of impoverished, stressed mothers are flooded with maternal stress hormones. These children arrive at birth with a stress response system that is already impaired, showing that critical failure to return to baseline calm after the stressful event is over. These are the first steps along a path that leads to disease and early death, and represent damage that cannot be entirely undone by later events. Poor children who attain a comfortable economic status in adulthood still experience more disease and die younger, on average, than their social class peers who were never impoverished. Given the grim risks associated with poverty, it is distressing to realize that the child poverty rate in this country is substantially higher than it was when Dr. King died. Child poverty had declined steadily in the last years of Dr. King's life, reaching its lowest level in 1969, when 14% of U.S. children under 18 were poor. But child poverty rates rose steeply in the 1980s, and in the years of the 21st century, they have risen sharply again. Today, as we've heard, a fifth of all U.S. children live in poverty, and poverty remains racialized. More than 1 in 3 Black or Hispanic children live in poverty today, compared to 1 in 8 white non-Hispanic children. And these figures were determined using a poverty line of approximately $2,000 a month for a family of 4, a figure painfully smaller than the sum needed to live a decent life in this country. Millions of families above the poverty line also suffer high levels of economic stress. Our country is alone today among the industrialized nations of the world in having child poverty rates of this magnitude. We also have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country. And as we've heard, and my statistics may be slightly different ways of slicing the pie, the richest 1% of the US population owns 40% of all our wealth, and most of that wealth is concentrated among the top 1/10 of 1%. Meanwhile, the bottom 60% own less than 2% of the nation's wealth, and the wealthiest 400 individuals in this country own as much as does half the population of the United States, 150 million people. As Rebecca Solnit observed in Harper's Magazine last month, society has been divided into a desperate majority and an obscene minority that hoards wealth so colossal it's meaningless. Not meaningless, of course, in a political sense. As a new Politico study reports, the 100 biggest campaign donors last year, 100 individuals, gave $323 million to their favorite candidates, which was almost as much as the $356 million given by everyone in this country who gave $200 or less to their candidates, and that was almost 5 million people. Just as poverty has been implicated in physical and emotional illness and premature death, economic inequality has been shown to be an excellent predictor of just about every physical, emotional, and social ill that social scientists study. More unequal nations have lower life expectancies, higher infant mortality rates, more homicides, poorer math and literacy scores, more teenage pregnancies and births, more obesity, more mental illness, including drug and alcohol addiction, more incarceration, and less economic mobility than more equal nations. The United States, which is the developed world's most unequal major nation, also ranks at or near the bottom on all of these indicators of the quality of our lives. Other high inequality nations, such as Portugal and the United Kingdom rank poorly as well. The world's most equal nations, such as Japan and Sweden, show the lowest levels of all these problems. And this pattern is replicated if we examine these same social ills among the 50 US states. The most equal states consistently outperform the least equal states on all of these problems, with those in more equal states living longer and healthier lives. Nor are the negative effects of economic inequality limited to the poor. And I think this may be the most important sentence in my talk tonight. Rather, persons of all social classes suffer more in unequal places than their social class peers in places of more equality. The deadly effects of income inequality appear to be due to the stresses of life in a winner-take-all economy, the skewing of social policies in favor of the wealthy at the expense of the poor and the middle class, and losses in social cohesion and trust. In national surveys, the extent to which Americans express trust in each other has declined precipitously. Cross-sectional analyses reinforce this picture, showing that in US states with high levels of income inequality, trust in others is far lower than in states with lower levels of income inequality. Juliet Schor has argued that the vast discretionary incomes of the wealthiest Americans, their lavish lifestyles, and the advertising images meant for them, but viewed by many others, have fueled overspending, overextended credit, economic anxiety, and a wave of bankruptcies among Americans. I, of course, like everyone else, tries to ignore commercials, but I couldn't help but be struck recently by ads promising that owning the automobile shown what would be valuable about it? It would incite painful envy in onlookers. That's the only attribute that was shown in an expensive ad. In one such ad, a husband and wife stare at the new car their neighbor has just purchased. The wife suggests that their neighbor may have received a raise. The husband says, "Lucky him," and the wife responds, "Lucky her." Apparently, what women want in a husband is the buying power to afford an extravagant car. Husbands should take note and quail if they cannot keep pace. The advertiser is actively stoking and legitimating economic anxiety. And what of the advertiser's image of neighbors? Apparently, neighbors are those we observe at a distance for status cues, not those with whom we actually interact, even if we do share roughly the same economic status. The wider the economic gaps between us, the more social status matters, and the more important are markers of status, like expensive cars. The more social status matters, the more likely we are to feel shame and humiliation rather than a sense of connection to others. The problems I have been describing, I'm going to put in another paragraph. The wealth of the advantaged also creates a housing market that displaces those who cannot keep pace with rapidly rising housing costs, fracturing communities and producing homelessness and the fear of becoming homeless. In San Jose, the capital of California's Silicon Valley, city contractors last month tore apart and cleared away the nation's largest outdoors homeless encampment, where about 300 people were living. Silicon Valley, with its intense concentration of wealth, has seen housing costs soar. Along with its 34 billionaires, Silicon Valley now has the nation's highest percentage of homeless people living on the streets. The problems I have been describing this evening can be solved, and the most encouraging thing to me is that our country was not always like this. When I was the age of most of you, this country was not at all like this in this way. As labor leader Richard Trumka recently said, "We are tired of people talking about inequality as if nothing can be done." The answer is simple. Raise the wages of the 90% of Americans whose wages today are lower than they were in 1997. And I would add, reducing the incomes of the wealthy also can be accomplished by raising the top income tax rate, as President Obama has proposed, enacting a transaction fee on stock market transactions, and restoring laws that keep vast sums of private wealth out of our electoral system. Given the stranglehold of the wealthy on our political system, enacting such measures will require the kind of social movement that toppled Jim Crow half a century ago. It may well be, as Dr. King said in his talk to the American Psychological Association, that our world is in dire need of a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Men and women should be as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustices of his day could cry out in words that echo across the centuries, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream," or as maladjusted as Abraham Lincoln, who in the midst of his vacillations finally came to see that this nation could not survive half slave and half free, or as maladjusted as Thomas Jefferson, who, in the midst of an age amazingly adjusted to slavery, could scratch across the pages of history words lifted to cosmic proportions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And, Dr. King concluded, through such creative maladjustment, we may be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. Thank you.
The research that you and folks like Dr. Wilkinson have done on the effects of income inequality to everyone in a society, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd be very happy to answer that question. Thank you. Yes, the research that I discussed that looked at how nations fare on all of these indicators of well-being it's been done by many different people, many epidemiologists. It's not research that I've personally done. One of the greatest figures in this area is Richard Wilkinson, who with his colleague Kate Pickett wrote a splendid book a few years ago, which I highly recommend, called The Spirit Level. And Wilkinson and Pickett also make available online a wonderful set of slides which illustrate all of these phenomena. But the book has an absolutely redundant, repetitive pattern. They look first at, let's say, life expectancy, and we look at a chart of how various nations in the world are ranked on economic inequality and how they rank on life expectancy. And we see a very striking diagonal in the slide that with increments of more equality, people live longer. And we see that the most equal nations, people live longer, and the least equal nations, people live the shortest amount of time. And then we see another chart that ranks nations by how wealthy they are. And the United States is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. And we see that that is irrelevant to life expectancy. And then we see the same pattern for the US states, that in the most equal states, people live the longest time, but in the richest states, it doesn't matter. It has no impact on life expectancy. Then we move to homicides. We see the same pattern. Then we move to math scores of elementary school children. Then we move to incarceration rates, economic mobility. It's a stunning pattern, and it goes on and on and on. And I highly recommend these slides. If you Google it, the Spirit Level slides, I'm sure you'll access them.
I was interested to know which are the equal states and which are the unequal. Do you know that data?
Yes, and I can give you some ideas about it, and you can check with this research. The most unequal states, not so surprisingly, are the states of the old Confederacy and states like New York and California are highly unequal. There are equal states, relatively equal states in New England, I think Vermont, New Hampshire. There are relatively equal states, or highly equal states in the Midwest, some of them. Massachusetts falls somewhere on toward the positive end, I think, for equality, but we're not a leader in economic equality. And I should mention that while Wilkinson and Kate Pickett did a lot of the research on the international work, one of the real people who spearheaded the state-level analysis for many years going back now is Ichiro Kawachi and his colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health. And those two bodies of data, one set of people analyzing data which they got from international sources like UNICEF, and one set of people analyzing US national data that they had from various archives, converging with the identical finding. And there are no real surprise. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of boring material. There are no surprises. If you tell me the economic equality level of a state or nation, I'll make excellent predictions for you about life expectancy, infant mortality, mental illness.
As speaking to college students, do you have some advice as to how to be creatively maladjusted?
I would first say I think maybe do a little bit of reading and research on this if you are moved to do so, and then tell all your friends, and get engaged in social movements, and of course, ideally, create a social movement that I could also join. I mean, I think we've had some wonderful action. I think the Occupy movement got the notion of the 99%. We are the 99% on the map, and I think that was a tremendous accomplishment. And people who say, well, the movement faded away, it doesn't. I think it changed the public consciousness, which is what a movement has to do as a first step. I think in our own lives we can be very sensitive to this issue of inequality. Why am I purchasing this object, which may incite envy in many? And anytime that you can give money to people who have less than you, you have reduced inequality in your community. Tip well. But I wish I had more thoughts, but I would love to engage in discussions about what can be done. I think things are happening. The political system has really shut down the effort for the moment to make a national minimum wage increase, but there are laws that have passed successfully in many states and municipalities, and I hope it just catches fire more. Thank you.